Okay, thank you so much, Carol, for kicking off the day, and Margaret for that opening prayer. Hi, Catherine. It is always inspiring and uplifting to see you. No big introduction here. You don't need it. We've only got a half hour to get together with all these folks at the summit and beyond and save the planet. And you, with your science and faith and people background, are probably one of the very few best people in the world to talk about that way. So let's jump in. We've got this big, very obvious problem, and the consequences of solving it, of not solving it, are immense, dwarfed only by the benefits of actually solving it. We haven't been able to move society to save itself. Why not?
It's not because we lack the science. We've known since the 1800s that digging up and burning coal back then, and then oil and gas today, produce heat-trapping gases that are building up in the atmosphere, wrapping an extra blanket around the planet. It was 1965 when scientists were so worried about the impacts of climate change, they warned a U.S. president of the need for action. That was Lyndon B. Johnson. So we don't need more pictures of melting ice sheets and more data on ocean heat content. We need to understand two things. Number one, how this matters to us here, where we live, now, today, and in ways that are relevant to us, the safety of our homes, the food that we eat, our kids' future. We also need to understand what solutions look like because, Bob, 70% of people in the U.S. are already worried about climate change. 83% of mothers are worried. 86% of young people are worried, yet 50% of us, according to the Yale Program on Climate Communication, 50% of us feel helpless and hopeless and don't know where to start. So we need to understand, first of all, the risks, but then we also, at the very same time, in the same breath, need to understand what real solutions look like. That's what we need to move forward together.
That's fantastic. What matters to us and what the solutions are. And I do have to hold up the book because this whole conversation is grounded in saving us. And if you don't have a copy yet, recommend that you get it. Whoops, looking at the wrong screen. So get the book. But okay, so let's get into the thing about people talking about it, because you've been saying for probably at least the last 5 years that we've got enough science, we understand that enough, but what we've got to do is get people to talk about it. And as you say, 75% of Americans say they're concerned, but only 14% of them say that the people around them are very concerned. So what's that? Is it that people are afraid to talk about climate change, or they just don't know what to say?
Well, the data shows that we're not talking about climate change. Only about 30% of people ever even hear somebody else talk about it occasionally. And what we talk about is the window to our minds. How do we know what other people are thinking if we never talk about it? Now, of course, talking is not sufficient, but it is an essential first step, because how do humans work together without communication? That's how important it is. So why are we not doing it? Well, there's a few different reasons. First of all, it's depressing. And if we don't think there's anything we can do to fix it, which most people feel, again, helpless and hopeless and don't know what to do, why talk about a problem we don't know how to fix? I would rather not talk about something if there's nothing I can do about it. So really helping people understand what solutions look like, how we can make a difference as individuals, how we can effectively engage not just our carbon footprint, but our climate shadow, how we can influence others at our school, our place of work, our church, our community. That is so empowering, and it gives people something to talk about. That's good news. We also are worried that, well, I'm not a scientist. That's okay. We need people to talk about their heart and their hands. Why do you care? What are you passionate about? Because you're a mom or a person of faith, or because you enjoy skiing, or you enjoy fishing, or because you're a Rotarian. Whoever you are, that's where you start the conversation. Connect the dots. And in my book, I talk about people who say, well, how do I start talking about it with my friends? And I said, well, what do you like doing with your friends? And they said, we cook together. So I said, talk about food and climate change. And then another person said, well, how do I talk about it to my grandma? And I said, what do you do with your grandma? She said, knit. I said, look at the warming stripes. Knit a warming stripe scarf for where you live and ask your grandma questions about all the different years. Begin with something we have in common, connect the dots to why it matters, and then talk about our hands, how there are real practical solutions that make a difference. And then the last reason people don't talk about it is because they think the only person they need to talk about it with is that person they know who's dismissive. The person who always brings up how, it's just a hoax or a natural cycle, and they're always posting on Facebook about it. Dismissives are 8% of the population, and I believe it truly takes a miracle to change a dismissive's mind. I think I might have seen a miracle or two, but I don't think I had anything to do with them. So leave the dismissives alone. Talk to everybody else. People say, well, everybody thinks the same way as I do. Why talk about it? Because 70% are worried, but 8% are activated. 8% are activated. So what's the goal of talking? To move people from being worried to being activated. And that begins by using our voice.
Well, every time we hear about climate change, though, it's kind of like ominous. It's kind of like, there's a big problem. It's 70 degrees warmer at the South Pole than it's supposed to be today, or 40 degrees warmer at the North Pole. These are actual statistics from just a couple days ago. And so everything you read in the news is like, doomsday and guilt and all the other kind of stuff. If that doesn't work, I mean, it's hard for me to not do that. You're really good at but how do we bring these other people along and get them to leave some of the guilt behind and get into what matters, the empowering things?
Mm-hmm. I'm so glad you asked that question, Bob. Yes. So the alarming headlines are so frequent these days that we're almost numb to them. What am I supposed to do about a heat wave in Antarctica? And I'm a climate scientist, and I don't even know what I'm supposed to do about that. So how does anyone else know what to do? Our news media, our for-profit news media, thrives on headlines that people click because they're discouraging, depressing, scary, or fearful. If we depend on the news to make us feel hopeful, it is never going to happen. Instead, we have to go out and we have to look for that hope. And so in my book, I think probably the toughest chapter I wrote was the chapter on guilt. The idea that we feel paralyzed. Fear and guilt paralyze us. And if we're paralyzed, we are doomed. So rather than saying, oh my goodness, I can't believe that I just did that, or I can't believe that they just did this, focus instead on what could we do differently? How could we do this better? Look for examples of people who are doing things differently and better. Share those examples, and again, speak with your church. Speak with your congregation. Speak with your school or your place of work. Speak with whoever it is that you're engaged and involved with and say, how could we do things differently? I was talking to a firefighter yesterday, and he said, we're talking about how we could take some of our smaller trips with smaller vehicles that don't require as much gas. We're also looking at whether they make electric fire trucks, which they're starting to, and how much they would cost and when we could start to buy some of those. I mentioned that biodiesel exists, which isn't carbon neutral, but it's definitely lower carbon than regular diesel. Just use your voice to talk about, again, why it matters and what we can do to fix it. Because too often, the more paralyzed and the more scared we get, we just feel temporarily better by pointing fingers at people and judging people, but it doesn't make them change, and it doesn't actually fix the problem.
Just for the audience here, we're going to take a few questions in a little bit, and so if you hit the Q&A tab on the right, you can type things in, and we will ask Katharine. Katharine, so talking about it is important. Like you have said, the biggest problem isn't the people who aren't on board. The biggest problem is people who don't know what to do. What should they be doing beyond talking? Should they be doing anything beyond talking? And how do we get them to do it?
Yes. And how do you get them to do it is you begin by talking, obviously, because how does a human do anything other than when we learn about something? And how do we learn about something when we hear it or we read it, right? So when I say talking, some of it could be written, some of it could be on social media, some of it could be recorded, some of it could just be doing something where someone else can see you doing it. Like when I first got a plug-in car and we had to leave it plugged in outside the house for the first couple of weeks because we didn't have an outlet in the garage. And seeing that car plugged in outside, all of our neighbors, as they went by, would stop and they would say, "What is that?" Now, this was a few years ago. "Where did you get that? Does it have a gas pedal and a steering wheel? How much did it cost?" And so even that was a form of actually serendipitous communication in sharing information with people. And then what should we do after that? Anything, and talk about it. Take personal action in your life to reduce your food waste, eat more plants, change out how you get your electricity, do an efficiency audit on your house, do whatever you do, and then talk about it. talk to, again, wherever you live, wherever you work, wherever you play, wherever you worship. Every single one of us is part of a sphere that's bigger than ourselves. And how does any organization change? How do they change? When individuals use their voices to advocate for that change within that system. That's how change happens. So I really do mean it. Do something, anything, and talk about it. Look at what a company is doing and talk about it. Look at what your city is doing and talk about it. Look at what your state is doing or a nonprofit organization is doing and talk about it. There's so much to engage us and move us from doom and despair to action. But it begins with knocking over that first domino.
Well, you have been a contributor to the IPCC reports probably since the beginning, but in the Working Group 2 report that just came out a couple of months ago, it was the first one that included social scientists. It was the first one to bring up the topics of misinformation, like the oil companies, and maladaptation, like doing wood pellets or biofuels. It seems like profit always trumps nature and planet and people for corporations. Maybe it always has. But so how can we overcome those forces? I mean, it feels like we're trying and doing good, but they got a lot more money and a lot more power. What do we do?
Well, first of all, I do have to say I have not been an IPCC author, but I have contributed my research to those reports. I've been a lead author on the U.S. National Climate Assessment for the last 15 years almost, which is quite a long time. And the IPCC has included social scientists for some time because that's how we develop our future scenarios, looking at demographics and technology and other aspects of humans, because humans are the ones responsible for this problem. But the latest report that just came out is Volume 2. The IPCC report comes in 3 volumes. Volume 1 came out in August. It talks about the physical impacts of climate change on ocean heat content, on the ice sheets, on glaciers, on global temperature. It was the code red report. In other words, sounding the alarm yet again. Then the report that came out a couple of weeks ago was Working Group 2 that talks about how is it affecting us, where we live, in ways that matter, our water, our food, our infrastructure, our agriculture, and more. It showed how we are adapting, but nowhere near fast enough. And I would actually nickname that report your house is on fire. So it isn't just the alarm that's ringing, it's your house that's burning down and you need to take action. And then we have a third report coming out very soon. And it deals specifically with responses, technological mitigation responses. And we need to understand all of the above to understand what we can do about this problem. So there is no silver bullet. Now, people often claim that there is, or they wish that there was, but there isn't. But what there is a lot of silver buckshot, so to speak. We need to be more efficient with our energy. Through efficiency alone, we could cut U.S. carbon emissions in half. We need to accelerate the transition to clean energy. We need to use nature to pull carbon out of the atmosphere and put it back in our soils, in our coastal wetlands, in our grasslands, in our ecosystems, in our trees where we want it, rather than up in the atmosphere where we have too much of it. And we need to build resilience to the impacts we can no longer avoid. We need all of those, and that's why I'm so glad to join the Nature Conservancy, as I just did last summer, as their chief scientist, because they are very focused on nature-based solutions. How can we, in agricultural technology and techniques, in ecosystem restoration, in smart deployment of bioenergy and biomass, because if you don't do it well, it can actually be just as bad as fossil fuels. How can we deploy nature in all of its amazing glory and the incredible technology known as photosynthesis to help us with our clean energy, with our efficiency, with our adaptation and resilience building, to help us with everything we need to accomplish the goals that we have? Because the IPCC reports conclude like this. They say, every bit of warming matters. Every year matters. Every choice matters.
Thank you, Katharine. On the social scientist side, was it just the part about the maladaptation and the misinformation that was in the last one, or I thought I read about that in the Guardian, that it was the first time that they put in misinformation and maladaptation. Is that true?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. All right. A couple other questions here from the audience here. One of them is asking, it's difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends on him not understanding it. And again, this goes back to, let's say, the fossil fuel companies, the utilities and things that depend on fossil fuel. Is there anything in particular that we can do to move those people along besides passing laws that force them to move along?
Yes. So often, again, I would encourage people to do what I do, which is called practicing active hope, which is going out and looking for and learning about what's being done. Because when you do that, you realize there is a lot going on that we, don't often see in the headlines. So, for example, with fossil fuel companies, number one, there are organizations like Engine Number One that are working within their shareholder system to force them to pass climate resolutions. So influence from shareholders can make a difference. You might know somebody who works in that industry. Personal connections can make a difference. There's definitely people who protest. There's people who divest. In fact, the Presbyterian Church of Ireland just sent me a message a couple of months ago saying that they had just voted to divest from fossil fuels, and they were reading from my book, Saving Us, the resolution to do so. And then, of course, there's policies like putting a price on carbon that would accelerate the transition by actually creating a level playing field, because right now the playing field is skewed very heavily in the favor of fossil fuels thanks to massive indirect and direct subsidies that far outweigh those on clean energy. So there's all kinds of different things that can be done at every single level, and all of us do have a role to play with that.
Katharine, we last year came very close, I think, to Build Back Better and actually getting the USA on a path to a 50% reduction by 2030, but we didn't quite make it. A lot of people attribute it to Senator Manchin, but there could be other reasons too. Where are we with that, and what do you think is going to happen over the next year?
Mm-hmm. Well, that was hugely disappointing, because what that bill did was it recognized that climate impacts, climate resilience, and climate mitigation are part of a larger issue. The reason we care about climate change is because it affects us. It affects our economy, our infrastructure, it affects jobs, it affects people's health. And so the Build Back Better bill really put climate action within the context of investing in infrastructure and investing in the economy to bring it out of the pandemic. It was a tremendous opportunity. And as I said, the IPCC is very clear, every year counts. So because that bill didn't pass when it did, we have already committed ourselves to a little bit of additional warming. What do we need to do? We need legislation as soon as possible that actually takes effective action. And from the perspective of the planet, there isn't one particular piece of policy that's ideal. But from the perspective of economists, they're very strongly in support of putting a price on carbon, because that's something that really helps to accelerate the whole transition in the marketplace, like we have in Canada today and in quite a few other countries around the world. But honestly, as a climate scientist, I just feel like we need something as much as possible and as soon as possible. But here's something that, again, we don't often think about, Bob, right? It isn't just up to the federal government, right? So cities, states, corporations, nonprofits, churches, tribal nations, all of these different organizations can set their own goals. And you know what? They are already doing it. Under the Trump administration, which officially withdrew from the Paris Agreement, enough other entities were still in on Paris to cover 60% of U.S. emissions. So just because we don't have something at the federal level doesn't mean that we have nothing. We are actually already moving significantly in that direction thanks to action below the federal level. And how does action below the federal level happen? It happens when individuals involved in that company, that city, that corporation, that state, that church, that nonprofit, it happens when they use their voice to say, hey, we need to set a goal. How do we do that? And how are we going to accomplish that goal? That's when change happens.
I brought up that so few people are actually talking about climate change. And part of it might be is that there are so many solutions around you. What you do at your home, you can put up solar panels, drive an electric car. And so, there's what you do at your workplace. Just get your workplace to make a public commitment to do a 50% reduction. Go to your community, go to your city hall, go to your town council meeting, you can get on the agenda and you can ask them what they're doing about climate change, and then we can all vote. We can all get involved in the activism that moves the political system forward. So there's so many solutions out there. Some people think that it's very important to have an enemy and name that enemy, and other people think it's important to just do the empowerment, the solutions. If we had to prioritize for these people, what might be the most effective thing to do? Is there any way to do that?
The most effective thing to do is a combination of, for you to do, is a combination of what needs to be done, what you particularly are good at, and what brings you joy. Right there is the sweet spot for a given person, and who you are is different than anyone else. So you might be a lawyer who's really good at going after the big polluters. You might be someone who wants to run a creation care team in your congregation. You might be a teacher who can teach your kids about climate change. And we have a little series called Global Weirding on YouTube that a lot of teachers are using. You might even be a child, and some of the most inspiring stories I've heard are how kids are making a difference, using their voices in their schools, with their friend groups online, making YouTube videos. That power is incredible when we realize it. And if you don't mind, Bob, let me tell one quick story from my book that sort of exemplifies the power of a single voice. So back in December 2018, my TED Talk was released, which is the most important thing you can do about climate change is talk about it. And there was a man called Glenn in England who lived in a suburb of London called Wandsworth who heard my TED Talk. And he had been banging his head against the wall trying to get his city, Wandsworth, to care about climate change. And he'd been getting nowhere. He saw my TED Talk and he figured, I'm just going to start having conversations about why it matters and about what we could do to fix it. So I was giving a talk near London 5 months later, and he took the train in, and afterwards he came up to me and he introduced himself, and he said, I have a list of all the conversations I've been having. Would you like to see it? I said, sure, I've never heard anybody doing that before. So he reached in his bag and he pulled out a list of 10,000 names of all the people he had spoken to, and then all the people they had spoken to, and all the people they had spoken to. And because of that, within 5 months, 10,000 conversations in a single borough, the city council had voted to declare a climate emergency. A year on, they voted to put up £20 million, which is quite a substantial sum for a small town, to build climate resilience. And they just sent me a message last week and said that the city has now created a website and a program called Climate Conversations, where they are deliberately holding conversations with the inhabitants of the town to talk about climate impacts and climate solutions and what they can do together. That's the power of a single person starting to use their voice.
Yeah, we do the American Climate Leadership Awards, and every year, we give 50,000, 25,000, 10,000. And when you go through these entries, you want to cry because there's so many people putting so much passion and being so affected. The city of Ann Arbor, tribal groups, there's just so many people that are doing that. But the other thing that's, I think, more related to you is that, I go up and down on climate change. I'm in a good mood sometimes, but I'm in a little bit of a depressed mood at other times. Somehow you seem to always have this great energy and positive things. How can we all get that kind of positive balance in our lives and move forward? What grounds you?
Well, we have to recognize, first of all, that this is scary. And if you feel anxious, you should feel anxious. That's a very reasonable and rational response to what's happening. So it isn't a case of saying, oh, I'm going to deny those feelings or suppress them or push them down. No, they are real, and they are telling you this is a problem. But it's what we do with that matters. And we have to make a conscious choice. We can't wait for hope to find us. We can't wait for the opportunity to act, to search us out and knock on our door. We have to go out and look for that hope. We have to go out and find those opportunities because, to use some words from Greta Thunberg, who I think should know what she's talking about, she said, the one thing we need more than hope is action, because when we act, hope is all around us. So when you're feeling discouraged, make a choice to do something or say something or have a conversation. Even if you're saying to somebody, I'm discouraged and I don't know what to do. Do you know anything hopeful? Tell me some good news. Go out and look for some good news of what people or places are doing. Share that news with others. Advocate for change wherever you are, because whoever you are the perfect person to have that conversation and spur that change with everyone you know.
And that's what ecoAmerica is working on, everyone, every day. How do we take that 14% that are talking about it, or 8%, and make that 60% or 70%? And all we have to do is read your book and do what it says, and we can make it happen. But Katharine, thank you so much. If you have any quick closing comment, please go for it. Otherwise, we're going to give it back to Susan and the team.
Sure, I'm gonna do one quick comment, which is this. People often ask me, how do I get people to care about X in order to act on climate? And my answer is, if you're trying to get everybody to care for the same reason you do, you have just made your job 10,000 times harder. It doesn't matter if one person cares because of X and another person cares because of Y. That is totally fine. Our job is not to make everyone care for the same reason we do. Our job is to figure out what reasons people already have to care and connect the dots to show them how who they already are is the perfect person to care and to act.